I never imagined my quiet life could hide such a betrayal. I was just cleaning my car while my husband and our son played in the yard when my mother-in-law called, demanding, "You need to come help me sort these old boxes in the attic." But as I opened a dusty chest, I discovered dozens of letters showing she had secretly drained my husband's inheritance. No wonder Dad never trusted her. The pain of that betrayal hit me hard, but I didn't panic. I took photos of everything, and silently, I was already setting the stage for justice to be served. I remember the first time I met my mother-in-law as if it were yesterday. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses from the garden. My husband had been hinting for weeks that I would finally meet the woman who had raised him, the woman he often spoke of with reverence and caution, his mother. I was nervous, of course, and I knew that first impressions mattered more than words could ever express. As we drove up the long, winding driveway of her house, my palms were sweaty, and I could feel my heart beating faster than usual. The house itself was large but elegant, the kind of home that carried generations of stories in its walls. I could see framed family portraits lining the hallway through the window, a young boy with his mother, a wedding day frozen in time, and a stern-looking man with a briefcase. Each photograph seemed to whisper secrets, though I had no idea what they might be. When she opened the door, my first thought was that she looked just like the photographs. Tall, poised, with dark skin that seemed to glow under the morning sun, and hair perfectly styled into soft waves. Her eyes, though, were what caught me off guard. They were sharp, almost calculating, and held a depth that I could not immediately read. She smiled, a polite smile, and yet there was a subtle tension in her lips that made me pause. I thought, perhaps she was just cautious, a little reserved with strangers. After all, I was stepping into her world, her family, her history. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "You must be the one my son has been telling me about." She extended her hand for a greeting. I reached out, trying to match her composure, but I felt a strange chill run through me when our hands touched. It was not coldness, exactly, but a silent judgment, an unspoken measuring of me against an invisible standard. I forced a smile and said, "It's so nice to finally meet you." She nodded, letting her gaze linger on me for a moment longer than necessary. Then, with the grace of someone who had spent decades controlling the room the moment they entered it, she stepped aside and motioned for us to come in. I took a tentative step forward, following her into a home that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, a mixture that felt both comforting and intimidating. My husband tried to break the ice. "Mom, this is my wife. I've told you so much about her." She turned to him, her expression softening slightly, just enough to remind me that she was capable of warmth. "I'm sure," she replied, and then to me she added, "I hope you will enjoy your time here." Her words were polite, but there was an edge beneath them, a quiet undertone that suggested she was already observing, calculating, and judging every gesture, every glance. We moved to the living room, where she gestured toward a set of perfectly arranged chairs. As we sat down, I noticed the smallest details, the way she had arranged the cushions just so, the family heirlooms displayed like trophies, and the subtle glint of a gold bracelet on her wrist that caught the sunlight every time she moved her hands. Everything about her radiated control and precision. It was beautiful, yet it made me slightly uneasy. I tried to find common ground, asking questions about the family history, her childhood, and her experiences raising my husband. She responded graciously, weaving stories of hardship and triumph, yet always steering the conversation in a direction that subtly reminded me that she was the center of her universe. At times, I laughed at her anecdotes, genuinely enjoying her wit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath her elegance there was a quiet intensity, a power that demanded respect, whether or not I was willing to give it. As the morning unfolded, I observed my husband's interactions with her, noting the small gestures, the deference he showed, the gentle way he corrected her when she exaggerated a story about his childhood. It became clear that this woman had shaped not only him but the very way he moved through the world. And there I was, a new addition, trying to find my place within a carefully constructed kingdom where every smile, every nod, and every word seemed measured and intentional. By the time lunch was served, I realized that this first impression would stay with me far longer than I expected. Her kindness was real, yes, but it was layered, complex, and underpinned by a strength that was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. I could feel that my journey as a daughter-in-law would not be simple. The path ahead was delicate, requiring patience, strategy, and an understanding of a woman who had mastered the art of silent influence. Even as I laughed at her jokes and complimented her cooking, a part of me remained alert, aware that every smile, every gesture could hold hidden meaning. That first impression, the elegance, the sharp gaze, the subtle power, was a warning and an invitation all at once. I left that visit with a mix of admiration and apprehension, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of a story far more intricate than I could have imagined. In that moment, I promised myself that I would not simply survive in her world. I would learn, observe, and quietly navigate the dynamics, understanding that the greatest power often comes not from confrontation, but from patience, subtlety, and the ability to act when others least expect it. That promise, formed in the warmth of a sunny morning and the cool precision of her gaze, would shape every step I took in the months and years to come. The beginning of our marriage was, in many ways, everything I had dreamed of as a child, the excitement, the hope, and the promise of a future built with someone I truly loved. Our wedding had been a modest, yet elegant affair. The sun had shone brightly over the garden venue, and the scent of fresh lilies and roses lingered in the air. Friends and family gathered, smiling and laughing, and for those few hours, it felt as though the world had slowed just for us. My husband, radiant in his tailored suit, held my hand tightly as we exchanged our vows, promising love, trust, and loyalty to each other. Yet, even in the midst of joy and celebration, I felt the quiet, watchful presence of my mother-in-law. She had been seated in the front row, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were observing not only the ceremony but every guest, every smile, every whispered conversation. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of pride and scrutiny, that made me acutely aware that, for her, the wedding was not just a celebration of love but also a test. A test of my character, my intentions, and my ability to fit into the family she had meticulously shaped over decades. After the vows and the applause, the reception began. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the room. My husband and I danced our first dance as a married couple, feeling as if nothing in the world could touch us. But in the corner, I noticed my mother-in-law, her gaze unwavering, her hands clasped together in a way that suggested both pride and quiet disapproval. She whispered something to a family friend, and I caught a glimpse of a smirk that did not reach her eyes. At that moment, I realized that while the wedding celebrated our union, it also marked the beginning of my journey as a daughter-in-law navigating a complex, often invisible battlefield. In the days following the wedding, life settled into what should have been a peaceful routine. My husband and I moved into our small apartment, unpacking boxes filled with memories, gifts, and hopes for the future. I was thrilled by the thought of creating a home together, a sanctuary from the world, a place where laughter would echo and love would grow. Yet, even in these ordinary, tender moments, the presence of my mother-in-law loomed. She called frequently, offering advice that was often thinly veiled criticism, insisting that I follow family traditions, arrange the home correctly, or prepare certain meals in a specific way. One evening, she dropped by unannounced, claiming she wanted to see how her son was settling in with his new life. I greeted her politely, smiling as warmly as I could, but inside, a tension coiled in my chest. She walked through the apartment with precise steps, inspecting the furniture arrangement, the kitchen layout, and even the way my husband had organized his books. "You know," she said, pausing by the bookshelf, "in our family, we always align the books by height and color. It keeps things harmonious." Her voice was soft, almost tender, yet beneath it lingered a subtle critique that made my cheeks flush. I nodded politely, suppressing the urge to argue, and quietly rearranged a few books while she observed. Over time, it became clear that being a daughter-in-law in this family meant constantly negotiating between respect and individuality. Each visit, call, or comment from my mother-in-law felt like a subtle test of loyalty and competence. She was not overtly hostile, but there was a quiet, persistent pressure, a reminder that her approval was not easily given, and any misstep might be remembered and judged. I found myself learning the delicate art of patience, choosing words carefully and always maintaining composure, even when her remarks stung more than she intended. There were moments, however, when my husband unknowingly complicated things. His protective nature often led him to defend me, challenging his mother in ways that seemed minor to him but could escalate tensions dramatically. I admired his loyalty, yet I understood that his interventions often provoked more subtle forms of manipulation from her. She had mastered the quiet power of influence, the way a glance, a suggestion, or even silence could shift opinions, sway decisions, and maintain control. One particular evening stood out. We were hosting our first small family dinner after the wedding. The table was set with care, candles flickering, soft music playing in the background. My mother-in-law arrived, perfectly on time, dressed impeccably in a cream blouse and elegant jewelry. She complimented the food, nodded approvingly at the table arrangement, and engaged in polite conversation. Yet, I noticed the almost imperceptible furrow of her brow as she glanced at a chair that was slightly askew, and the way she rearranged a napkin with meticulous fingers. Every gesture was deliberate, a demonstration of control wrapped in civility. I realized then that the beginning of marriage was not just about love between my husband and me, it was also about navigating the silent battles with those who had the power to shape our lives. The wedding had been a joyful celebration, but marriage was more than vows and laughter. It was a complex web of relationships, traditions, expectations, and hidden judgments. And I knew that to survive, to thrive, and to protect the life we were building, I would need not only love and patience but also careful observation, strategy, and the ability to act when the time was right. As days turned into weeks, I noticed more patterns in her behavior. The way she complimented something while subtly undermining another, how she offered advice that seemed helpful but carried hidden expectations. Each interaction was a lesson in diplomacy, resilience, and subtlety. I found myself documenting moments mentally, remembering details, and understanding that the beginning of our marriage was also the beginning of a long, quiet education in reading people, anticipating moves, and silently preparing for challenges that might arise. By the end of the first month, I understood that love alone would not be enough to maintain peace and happiness. The mother-in-law's influence was quiet but pervasive, shaping opinions and decisions in ways I had not yet fully grasped. And so with each interaction, I learned to smile while observing, to listen while analyzing, and to remain calm while quietly preparing for the moment when patience would transform into action. The beginning of marriage had been sweet, filled with laughter, hope, and promise, but it had also been my first lesson in the delicate, invisible war that existed within family dynamics. A war fought not with words or anger, but with observation, subtle strategy, and silent resilience. And though I did not yet know the full extent of her control, or the secrets she would eventually reveal, I felt a spark deep inside, a determination to survive, to protect my husband and our future, and to quietly, strategically navigate the challenges that lay ahead. Even now, when I recall those early weeks, I realize that this was a stage where I learned the first rules of engagement, patience, vigilance, and subtle influence. Every smile, every polite nod, every gesture became a part of a larger understanding that marriage was not just about love, but also about strategy, resilience, and the ability to act quietly, decisively, and without confrontation when the right moment arrived. After the whirlwind of the wedding, and the initial excitement of settling into our new life together, I realized that being married was only the beginning of a much more complex journey. It was not enough to love my husband, to share laughter and dreams, or even to keep a warm and welcoming home. There was another presence, quiet yet undeniably powerful, whose approval seemed to define the very air we breathed, my mother-in-law. From the moment we first met, I understood that pleasing her would require far more than politeness or charm. It would demand strategy, patience, and careful observation of her moods, habits, and expectations. Determined to do everything I could to maintain peace and harmony in our new family dynamic, I began the delicate dance of trying to please her. I started with small gestures, the kind that might seem insignificant to an outsider but carried enormous weight in her eyes. On one Saturday morning, I arrived at her home with a basket of freshly baked pastries, hoping that the sweet aroma and the effort itself would convey respect and affection. She opened the door with that familiar measured smile, inspecting the pastries, as if they were not just treats but symbols of my character. "How thoughtful," she said, her voice calm, her eyes scanning my face for signs of sincerity or inadequacy. I nodded, smiling, careful not to overdo it. I knew better than to let my eagerness show too strongly. I had to appear natural, effortless. In the weeks that followed, I found myself constantly adjusting my approach. I learned the exact way she preferred her tea. No sugar, one splash of milk, stirred clockwise, and how she liked her couch cushions fluffed to just the right height. I attended family gatherings with enthusiasm, complimented her cooking, and shared anecdotes about our life with my husband, always careful to highlight how happy he was and how much I respected her role in shaping him into the man he had become. Every word, every gesture, every smile was calculated, not to manipulate, but to survive, to build trust, and to establish my place within this family that had its own unspoken rules and traditions. Even the simplest tasks became arenas of subtle negotiation. When I offered to help organize her pantry, I was careful to follow her system, noting how each jar was labeled and each spice arranged in alphabetical order. I observed how she preferred cans stacked by brand and date, how napkins were folded precisely 3 times, and how the tablecloths were ironed with exact creases. It seemed excessive, perhaps even obsessive, but I quickly learned that attention to these details was not mere preference. It was a reflection of control and order, a way she maintained power and tested the commitment of those around her. There were moments of genuine warmth, too, though they were often fleeting. Once, while preparing a meal together, she shared stories about raising my husband and his siblings, laughing at anecdotes about his childhood mischief and first crushes. For a brief moment, she seemed human, approachable, even affectionate. I listened carefully, nodding, laughing at the right moments, and offering empathetic comments that validated her experiences. But I also learned to read the subtle cues. A tightened jaw, a narrowed gaze, or a faint sigh could indicate disapproval, even if the words were kind. One evening, after another visit, I reflected on my efforts and realized how exhausting it was to maintain constant vigilance. I was learning, slowly, how to navigate the intricate web of expectations she had woven. Every compliment had to be measured, every gift carefully chosen, every action meticulously aligned with her standards. And yet, despite the challenges, I persisted. I wanted to build a foundation of trust, to show that I was a devoted wife, a considerate daughter-in-law, and someone who genuinely cared about the family she had built. At the same time, my husband's perspective often complicated things. He trusted me, believed in my good intentions, and encouraged me to relax, to be myself. But he did not always see the subtleties, the unspoken judgments, or the quiet corrections his mother imposed. On more than one occasion, he would shrug off a comment that had sent me into hours of self-reflection, insisting that she was just being herself, and that I shouldn't take it personally. I learned quickly that my survival, my dignity, and my ultimate peace of mind depended not on confrontation or explanation, but on careful observation, patience, and the ability to act with precision when necessary. Over time, my attempts to please became a skill in itself. I memorized her routines, her preferences, her moods. I noticed which flowers she liked on the dining table, which recipes brought a genuine smile to her lips, and which stories of her son's childhood she wanted to hear again and again. I even learned to anticipate her unspoken expectations, preparing for her visits in ways that would subtly convey respect, care, and attention to detail without appearing forced. There were challenges, of course. Sometimes, no matter what I did, she would offer a polite smile paired with a remark that left me questioning myself for hours. Other times, she would praise a gesture I thought minor, which reinforced the idea that her approval was earned not by quantity of effort, but by nuance, timing, and perception. I became hyper-aware of the balance between authenticity and strategy, knowing that each interaction was an opportunity to build credibility or risk alienation. Yet, despite the difficulty, these attempts to please served a greater purpose than mere compliance. They allowed me to learn her habits, to map her patterns, and to understand her psychology. Every smile, every nod, every carefully prepared dish became a lesson in patience, observation, and quiet resilience. I realized that by mastering the art of subtle engagement, I was not only surviving her scrutiny, but preparing myself for the day when I would have to act decisively. By the end of that year, I had become adept at navigating the delicate dynamics of our family. I had learned which words to say, which gestures to make, and which battles to avoid. I had discovered that while pleasing her was exhausting, it provided me with critical insight into her character, revealing vulnerabilities, patterns, and opportunities that I could leverage later, though at the time, I saw it only as a way to maintain peace. Looking back, I now understand that these attempts to please were not just acts of politeness or respect, they were the first steps in a subtle education in strategy, patience, and observation. Each effort, each carefully executed gesture, each meticulously prepared meal, was teaching me how to move within the invisible rules of her household, how to survive, and how to quietly prepare for the moments when silence would become the most powerful weapon of all. As the months passed, I began to notice small signs of warning in my interactions with my mother-in-law, subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent enough to make me question the reality of her kindness. It wasn't one single act that set off alarm bells. It was a series of tiny, almost invisible gestures that collectively painted a picture I couldn't ignore. At first, I brushed them off as quirks or eccentricities. After all, she had raised my husband, and her standards were undeniably high. Yet, deep inside, a seed of unease began to grow. It started with the way she observed everything, even when she wasn't in the room. I would catch her glances from the corner of my eye during phone calls or video chats, noticing her lips tighten, ever so slightly when I mentioned a small success or decision we had made as a couple. Once, while discussing our plans to repaint the living room, she commented casually, "Oh, that color is unusual. Are you sure it will suit him?" Her tone was light, polite, almost caring, but beneath it, I felt the faint shadow of judgment. I laughed it off, telling myself she was simply offering advice. Yet something in the back of my mind whispered, she is testing me, quietly measuring my choices. Another warning sign emerged during a family dinner. My husband and I had invited her to our apartment for the first time. Everything was meticulously prepared, the tablecloth ironed, candles lit, plates aligned with precision, and her favorite flowers in a vase at the center. I expected gratitude, perhaps a warm compliment, but instead, she paused as she surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over each detail, and remarked, "I see you've tried, but the napkins are folded incorrectly. It might not seem like much, but attention to detail matters." Her words were soft, almost motherly, but the meaning was clear. Nothing, no matter how well-intentioned, would ever be perfect in her eyes unless it conformed to her exacting standards. It wasn't just the words, it was the subtle power in her presence. I began to notice that when she entered a room, conversations would shift slightly. My husband would straighten subconsciously, our friends would adjust their tone, and I would find myself instinctively aligning my behavior with her expectations. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't scold or demand. Her influence was quiet, almost invisible, yet undeniable. Each small gesture carried weight, shaping the dynamics of the room without anyone even realizing it consciously. Even more concerning were the comments she made about finances, seemingly offhand but laced with meaning. One afternoon, while my husband and I were discussing our budget for a new car, she casually remarked, "You know, when we were young, we always made sure to save properly. Impulsiveness can lead to regrets." Again, it seemed harmless, almost educational, but I felt the underlying implication. She believed she knew better, and she subtly reinforced her control over how my husband and I managed our lives. Other signs appeared in the way she manipulated conversations about our family history. During one visit, she shared anecdotes about her own mother, carefully highlighting lessons in obedience, loyalty, and respect for tradition. She smiled warmly as she spoke, but there was a subtle tone of warning embedded in each story. I could sense her intention, not merely to educate, but to subtly remind me of my place, to reinforce that in this family, respect for her authority, and by extension, her worldview, was expected and non-negotiable. I also noticed how she reacted to gifts or gestures I made with care. For instance, on my husband's birthday, I had prepared a scrapbook of memories from our time together, including photographs, letters, and mementos. She leafed through it politely, smiling when appropriate, but I caught a fleeting glance, a raised eyebrow, a barely perceptible frown, as if to say, "This is nice, but not quite enough." These moments, fleeting and subtle, were like whispers of caution, signaling that nothing I did could ever be entirely beyond her scrutiny. Her subtle manipulation extended to my husband as well. I began to notice the tiny shifts in his behavior after she visited or called. He would unconsciously echo her opinions, adopt her phrasing, and sometimes second-guess decisions we had made together. It was never overt, never confrontational, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her influence was like water slowly shaping rock, soft, gradual, yet unstoppable if left unchecked. Perhaps the most alarming signs were the contradictions in her behavior. At times, she would shower me with praise for a well-prepared meal or a thoughtful gesture, only to later criticize similar efforts in a way that seemed almost experimental. I realized that each interaction was an evaluation, a quiet test of my reactions, my patience, and my composure. The unpredictability was exhausting, yet it also taught me something crucial. Survival required vigilance, observation, and careful control of my own responses. In addition to these behavioral signs, I began to notice patterns in her daily routines that revealed the extent of her control and influence. She had precise schedules for when certain tasks were to be completed, subtle rituals for meals, and almost imperceptible expectations about how others should behave in her presence. By observing these routines carefully, I could predict her reactions and prepare for them in advance, a strategy that would later prove invaluable in navigating the more serious conflicts to come. The small signs of warning were everywhere, embedded in mundane interactions, subtle critiques, and nuanced gestures. Together, they painted a picture of a woman who wielded power quietly, expertly, and strategically. They were subtle enough to be dismissed by the untrained eye, but consistent and persistent enough to create a growing awareness that life in this family required not only love and patience but also cunning, awareness, and quiet strength. Even as I smiled, laughed, and nodded during her visits, I was mentally cataloging each warning, each nuance, each subtle shift in tone. I began to document them in my mind, creating a mental map of behavior, preference, and influence. I was learning to read between the lines, to recognize the hidden messages in compliments, criticisms, and everyday gestures. Each small sign of warning became a clue, a lesson in understanding her character, and a step toward anticipating her next move. By the time I fully recognized the pattern, I understood something vital. These small warnings were not threats to provoke confrontation, they were tools of control. My mother-in-law was testing boundaries, establishing influence, and quietly shaping the environment to her liking. And in realizing this, I knew that my response could not be reactive or emotional. I had to observe, strategize, and act with precision. Every small sign of warning was an opportunity, a piece of intelligence in a subtle game of power that I had no choice but to master. It was in these quiet, seemingly ordinary moments, the polite criticism, the scrutinizing glance, the well-intentioned advice, that the true nature of the challenge became clear. My journey as a daughter-in-law, as a partner, and as a woman who wanted to protect her own happiness was not simply about love, respect, or compliance. It was about awareness, strategy, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge that would one day allow me to reclaim control, assert justice, and ultimately turn these small warnings into the foundation of a larger plan, a plan that no one, not even my mother-in-law, would see coming. It was a seemingly ordinary morning when the day that would change everything began. I had woken early as usual to tidy up the house and prepare breakfast for my husband and our young son. Sunlight poured gently through the curtains, dust motes dancing lazily in the warm glow. The ordinary rhythm of life, with its comforting simplicity, the smell of toast, the sound of laughter echoing from the living room, masked the storm that was quietly gathering just beyond the edges of my awareness. I had grown accustomed to the small signs of warning, the subtle manipulations, and the quiet power my mother-in-law wielded, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to uncover. The phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the calm. I saw my mother-in-law's name flashing on the screen. "Hello," I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral, casual. "You need to come help me sort these old boxes in the attic," she said, her voice calm, almost sweet, but with an edge that hinted at an expectation I could not yet grasp. She insisted, and I knew better than to refuse. Something in her tone suggested that this was not a casual request. There was a subtle tension underneath her words, a hidden agenda, but curiosity and the desire to maintain peace compelled me to go. I arrived at her home, stepping into the familiar hallway where portraits of her family lined the walls. I had walked past these images countless times, but today they seemed different. Each frame, each frozen smile, each pair of eyes staring back at me felt like a warning, a silent reminder that the past was carefully curated and closely guarded. She led me upstairs to the attic, a place I had rarely visited, dimly lit, with the scent of old wood and dust permeating the air. Boxes stacked high to the ceiling created narrow pathways, and I had to carefully maneuver around them. As she handed me a broom and some cleaning cloths, she smiled lightly, saying, "You can start over there. There's so much to go through." I nodded, trying to hide the tension that prickled at the back of my neck. It was an ordinary task on the surface, organizing, dusting, and sorting, but there was something in her demeanor, the way she watched me, that made the mundane feel charged with significance. I moved a few boxes aside and began to sort through their contents, old family photos, letters, and keepsakes spilling out onto the floor. Then, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed envelopes, I found it, a dusty chest, heavier than it looked, locked but slightly ajar. My heart beat faster, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through me. I lifted the lid slowly, revealing dozens of letters neatly tied with ribbons, stacks of papers, and financial documents that seemed far too important to be left in such a casual, forgotten space. At first, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Curiosity and a creeping sense of dread compelled me to open one of the envelopes. The handwriting was familiar, my husband's father, long deceased. The letter detailed financial matters, accounts, and inheritances that had been carefully managed by the family. As I read further, a chilling realization began to take shape. My mother-in-law had been secretly draining my husband's inheritance over the years, diverting funds into her own accounts, manipulating documents, and ensuring that no one else, including my husband, was aware. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My fingers trembled as I carefully sifted through more documents, each one confirming the same disturbing pattern. Checks, bank statements, handwritten notes, all pointed to a deliberate, calculated plan that had been executed for years. The woman who smiled at me so sweetly, who offered advice and gifts, who seemed to care for her family, she had been playing a long game, and my husband, the man I loved, had been unaware of the full extent of her actions. I whispered under my breath, almost to myself, "So this is why Dad never trusted her." The words hung in the air like a confession, a recognition of a truth that had remained hidden for decades. I realized then that the small signs of warning I had noticed, the subtle manipulations, the comments about finances, the careful observation of every gesture, were all pieces of a puzzle I was only now beginning to see clearly. She had never been cruel for the sake of cruelty. She had been strategic, calculating, and deeply protective of her control over the family's wealth and decisions. A mixture of emotions flooded through me: shock, disbelief, anger, and a strange, rising sense of clarity. I could see now the quiet patterns, the invisible threads that had guided her every move. And with that understanding came a profound realization: this was not a moment for confrontation. This was a moment for strategy, patience, and observation. I had to act carefully, for any misstep could alert her, and the consequences could be devastating, not just for me, but for the family I was trying to protect. I carefully photographed each document, every letter and financial statement. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Each click of the camera was a silent declaration, a meticulous record of truth that no one could dispute. I knew that these images would serve as evidence, not for immediate retaliation, but as the foundation of a plan that would unfold in its own time. I would not speak a word, not now, not ever until the moment was right. My mother-in-law, unaware of the meticulous record I had created, continued her quiet inspection of the attic, believing that her secrets remained safe. As I organized the documents back into the chest, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. The discovery of this big secret was terrifying, yes, but it was also clarifying. I could see clearly now the full scope of her influence, her cunning and her reach. The mother-in-law who had seemed invincible, who had subtly controlled the family with charm and discipline, was no longer untouchable. I held the knowledge, and with it came the power to act. I left the attic that day with a mixture of emotions, shock, anger, and a quiet satisfaction. The world felt heavier, more complicated, but also more vivid. I understood now that the journey I had embarked upon as a daughter-in-law was not merely about pleasing or surviving. It was about strategy, foresight, and the careful orchestration of events that would one day restore justice. And I knew that the secret, hidden in plain sight for years, was the key. That night, as I lay awake in bed, my husband sleeping peacefully beside me, I reflected on everything I had discovered. The letters, the financial documents, the hidden manipulations, they were not just evidence of wrongdoing, they were the roadmap for what was to come. The big secret had been revealed, and with it, the silent plan began to take shape. Every small observation, every effort to please, every patient action up to this point had led me here. The time for subtlety and careful strategy had arrived, and the real plan, quiet, precise, and unstoppable, was only beginning. The discovery of my mother-in-law's hidden manipulations changed everything, but it also marked the beginning of a silent conflict, one that would not be fought with words or confrontation, but with patience, observation, and strategy. I returned home that evening with my mind racing. Every moment, every interaction with her from that day forward would be a careful test, a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and quietly preparing for the inevitable exposure of her secrets. The first few weeks were the hardest. My mother-in-law continued her visits, her calls, her subtle remarks, all seemingly normal, but now I viewed every gesture through the lens of a secret I had uncovered. Every compliment carried suspicion. Every inquiry about our life or decisions seemed to have layers of hidden motives. I realized that the conflict would not be dramatic or explosive. It would be quiet, almost invisible, yet intensely powerful, a battle of minds and wills fought in silence, where patience was the sharpest weapon. At home, I began to analyze our interactions. I watched the way she positioned herself in photographs during family gatherings, the way she smiled with one corner of her mouth while her eyes flickered with judgment. I noted the slight tension in her voice when she discussed money or family decisions, the way her gaze lingered too long on my husband whenever we made a choice she had not approved. Every micro-gesture, every nuanced expression became a clue in the puzzle, a signal that the mother-in-law I had once tried to please was not merely a figure of tradition or habit. She was a silent force that could control perceptions, shape narratives, and manipulate outcomes. One afternoon, during a routine visit, she commented on a minor decision my husband and I had made about our living room furniture. "Oh, I see you've moved the sofa again," she said lightly, her tone casual. "It's interesting. I remember your father preferred a more symmetrical arrangement. It just feels more orderly, don't you think?" I nodded politely, but inwardly, I felt the prick of irritation and realization. She was testing me, subtly reminding me of her influence over the family's taste, over traditions, and over the very environment my husband and I were trying to cultivate. This was the essence of a silent conflict, the power to challenge without openly challenging, to control without confrontation. Even my husband seemed unaware of the full extent of her influence. He loved his mother and trusted her implicitly. He would defend me gently when minor critiques arose, yet he often laughed off the undercurrents, unaware of the layered intentions behind her words. I understood then that I could not rely on him to see the battle as I saw it. This conflict was mine to navigate alone, requiring careful attention, quiet calculation, and the restraint to act only when the timing was perfect. In the days that followed, I began to refine my approach. Every interaction became a study in patience. I complimented her gently, acknowledging her wisdom without conceding my own autonomy. I asked for her advice on small, inconsequential matters, allowing her to feel in control while I subtly steered the conversation toward my goals. I learned to smile when she criticized, to nod when she suggested, and to record in my mind every detail, every pattern, every small inconsistency that could later be used as leverage. There were moments of tension, subtle but undeniable. One evening, she visited while my husband and I were preparing dinner. As I arranged the vegetables and spices, she observed quietly, occasionally offering a comment or suggestion. "You know," she said, holding up a jar of paprika, "my son always preferred the spice measured precisely. Just a pinch too much can overwhelm the flavor. It's a simple thing, but important." Her tone was calm, polite, almost motherly. Yet, beneath it, I could feel the silent judgment, the reminder that in her eyes, I was still under evaluation. I realized that the conflict was psychological, a test of resilience and composure. It was not about overt confrontation or dramatic outbursts. It was about maintaining presence, patience, and calm under pressure. I had to act with precision, to respond without anger, to allow her actions and words to reveal her methods, all while maintaining the appearance of respect and harmony. Every moment of silence became a battlefield where intellect, observation, and subtlety were the most potent weapons. My mother-in-law's influence extended beyond words. I noticed the way she positioned herself in family photos, subtly commanding attention even without speaking. I observed how relatives unconsciously deferred to her during discussions, how her opinions were given more weight than mine, even on trivial matters. Each interaction reinforced the necessity of the silent conflict strategy to gain awareness, to plan, and to act only when the outcome could be controlled and irreversible. Even ordinary conversations became exercises in caution. When she inquired about our plans for a weekend getaway, I answered politely, carefully choosing words that acknowledged her interest without revealing too much. I asked her opinion on minor details, letting her feel included and valued, all while I quietly mapped the boundaries of her knowledge and influence. It was a dance of subtlety and calculation, where every word, glance, and gesture mattered. During family gatherings, I perfected the art of strategic observation. I watched her interactions, noting the way she complimented one person while subtly undermining another, the slight tension when she mentioned inheritance, and the way she controlled narratives without speaking forcefully. Each nuance was a lesson, each observation a clue, and I began to see the full pattern of her control, the invisible threads she wove to shape the family according to her vision. Despite the tension, there were moments of apparent calm, almost deceptive in their simplicity. She would smile at me, offer compliments, or engage in light conversation, creating the illusion of harmony. Yet beneath that calm was a quiet vigilance, a reminder that the silent conflict was ongoing, invisible to everyone else, and incredibly potent. I had to remain alert at all times, understanding that the real battle was not public but internal, psychological, and strategic. The silent conflict also forced me to reflect on my own responses, to cultivate patience and strategic foresight. I could no longer act impulsively or emotionally. Every gesture, every word, every reaction had to be deliberate, measured, and purposeful. I documented mental notes, recorded patterns, and learned to anticipate her moves, preparing for the moment when observation and preparation would translate into decisive action. By the end of the month, I had developed a quiet mastery over this invisible battlefield. I could navigate her presence, her influence, and her subtle judgments with grace, using silence and composure as shields and strategy as my sword. I understood now that the silent conflict was not just a challenge, it was a lesson, a test, and the prelude to something far greater. The mother-in-law who had once seemed untouchable, who had subtly controlled the family with precision and charm, was now a figure whose patterns I understood and whose influence could eventually be countered. The silent conflict, with its invisible tensions and subtle manipulations, had revealed one truth: power need not be loud to be devastating. And in recognizing this, I began to prepare, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with quiet determination, careful planning, and the knowledge that one day the balance of control would shift in ways she could never anticipate. The battle had begun, silently, invisibly, and I was ready. By the time I reached the 7th month of our marriage, I had learned that the true battlefield with my mother-in-law was not in arguments, loud confrontations, or outright disputes. It was in silence, in subtle glances, in the careful monitoring of every word, gesture, and expression. These moments of observation became the cornerstone of my survival strategy, and unknowingly, the foundation of the plan I would one day put into motion. It began with quiet, almost imperceptible acts. I would sit at the kitchen table while she visited, pretending to pour tea and engage in small talk, all while carefully studying her expressions. The way her eyebrows arched at certain comments, the faint tightening of her lips, the subtle twitch of her fingers as she held a cup, each detail became a puzzle piece in understanding her behavior. I discovered that the slightest hesitation in her voice could indicate disapproval, and the faintest smile could mask manipulation. Every encounter became a masterclass in reading human behavior, and I took meticulous mental notes. Even during mundane family gatherings, my focus shifted. I observed how she interacted with my husband, how her tone softened when discussing the past, and how her eyes flickered with calculation when the conversation turned to money, property, or family decisions. She had perfected the art of control without confrontation, quietly shaping opinions while maintaining an air of warmth and care. I realized that to outmaneuver her, I had to match her precision, patience, and subtlety, but with an advantage she could never detect: awareness. I began carrying a small notebook with me at home, discreetly jotting down patterns I noticed, though always careful that she remained unaware. I recorded the times of her visits, the topics she favored, the phrases she repeated, and the methods she used to influence my husband or other family members. Each observation was a building block, a piece of intelligence that would eventually allow me to act strategically, decisively, and silently. One afternoon, while she was inspecting our living room during a casual visit, I noticed a recurring habit. She rearranged the cushions on the sofa, straightened the edges of the carpet, and subtly nudged objects into place. Not once did she comment verbally, but her eyes tracked every small imperfection. I realized that these small gestures were not merely about aesthetics. They were a method of asserting control, reminding me that nothing was ever entirely acceptable in her presence unless it aligned with her standards. I made a note of it in my mind: control through observation and subtle correction. My observation extended beyond behavior to patterns in speech. I began to notice the strategic way she asked questions, framing them as innocuous inquiries while actually probing for weaknesses or information. "Oh, you're planning a weekend trip? How lovely! But do you think it's the right timing financially?" At first, I laughed at the comment, but the subtle implication was clear. She was testing, evaluating, and influencing decisions without overt criticism. I recorded these patterns mentally, understanding that recognizing the hidden layers of meaning was crucial for navigating the silent conflict. Even my husband became an object of observation, not in a cold or distant way, but in a protective and analytical sense. I studied how he responded to her comments, how his tone shifted slightly when she spoke, and how he unconsciously sought approval while attempting to mediate between us. These moments revealed vulnerabilities and habits that I could later use to ensure our interests were protected and that the truth, when revealed, would have maximum impact. I also observed the way she managed her household, the way she controlled information, and the rituals she followed. Her day was filled with precise routines: letters filed meticulously, bills sorted in exact order, and items labeled with obsessive detail. Each observation reinforced the understanding that control was not spontaneous but methodical, and that her sense of authority extended far beyond what she openly displayed. The subtlety of her influence became even more apparent during family dinners. She would compliment one person, critique another, and skillfully steer conversations to reinforce her worldview and assert her presence. By sitting quietly and observing, I could anticipate the responses of each family member, noting who would comply, who would resist, and who would unconsciously align with her intentions. This information was invaluable, allowing me to plan actions in advance without raising suspicion. Some of the most critical moments of observation occurred during seemingly ordinary visits. While folding laundry, I would notice how she interacted with household objects, the order in which she placed things, and the faint micro-expressions that betrayed satisfaction or disapproval. While discussing plans for the week, I observed the tone she used, the emphasis on certain words, and the subtle body language that communicated more than speech ever could. These moments, mundane to anyone else, were goldmines of information for someone learning to navigate a web of quiet control and manipulation. I also began to recognize emotional patterns. Her warmth was often conditional, her kindness measured, and her laughter strategic. She could charm a room while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt or insecurity. By carefully observing these moments, I learned to anticipate her moves, to remain calm when provoked subtly, and to control my own responses in a way that would ensure composure, dignity, and strategic advantage. Another crucial aspect of my observations involved timing. I noticed that certain discussions or remarks were more likely to occur at specific times of the day or during particular settings, such as when my husband was occupied with work or our son was napping. These patterns indicated not randomness, but deliberate orchestration, a carefully constructed environment where influence could be exerted with minimal resistance. Understanding this allowed me to anticipate her behavior and subtly prepare countermeasures, all without her knowing that I was aware of the strategy at play. Over the months, these moments of observation became my private classroom. I learned not only about her but also about myself, my patience, my resilience, my ability to stay composed under scrutiny, and my capacity for strategic thinking. Each small detail, her micro-expressions, gestures, questions, and routines, became part of a larger map, a silent blueprint that would guide my actions when the time came to confront the truth and restore justice in a manner both decisive and unobtrusive. By the end of this period, I had become acutely aware of her habits, her subtle manipulations, and her silent control. But I also had something she lacked: foresight, awareness, and documentation of every detail. Every glance, every comment, every movement had been cataloged and stored mentally. These moments of observation were no longer passive. They were an active, ongoing collection of intelligence, quietly preparing me for the day when silence would transform into action. I realized then that this was the essence of a silent conflict. It was not about open confrontation, but about understanding, patience, and preparation. Every moment I observed, every detail I recorded, brought me closer to a position of quiet power. I had learned to see beyond appearances, to read between the lines, and to anticipate her moves with precision. The mother-in-law, who had seemed untouchable, was now a study in patterns, and each observation brought me one step closer to reclaiming control and revealing the truth in a way that would leave no doubt about her deception. These moments of observation, seemingly mundane yet profoundly powerful, became the foundation of the plan that was slowly taking shape. I smiled politely, nodded at her suggestions, and engaged in small talk, all while quietly cataloging every nuance of behavior, every subtle shift in tone, and every micro-expression. In the world of silent strategies, awareness was the ultimate weapon, and with each passing day, my arsenal grew stronger. And as I stood quietly in the background, observing her as she moved through our lives, I felt a strange mix of fear, respect, and anticipation. The silent war had been quietly raging all along, and now, armed with knowledge and patience, I was ready to take the first steps toward the justice that had long been denied, knowing that the power of observation was the key to transforming hidden awareness into decisive action. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sunlight filters softly through the curtains, and the house hums with ordinary domestic life, the perfect camouflage for a revelation that would shatter my perception of everything I thought I knew. I had been meticulously observing my mother-in-law for months, cataloging her habits, subtle manipulations, and patterns of influence. I thought I had prepared for everything, that I had accounted for every subtlety and nuance. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon in the attic that day. I had been sent, or perhaps invited, to help her with some old family boxes, another routine task, she said, framed as a casual request but charged with her familiar undertone of expectation and subtle control. As I maneuvered through the narrow aisles of stacked boxes and forgotten heirlooms, I noticed a chest tucked away in a dark corner, slightly hidden behind dusty, unused furniture. Its presence was deliberate, I could tell, as if she wanted it out of immediate sight. My pulse quickened. The chest had intrigued me for weeks, but now, something inside urged me to open it. Inside, layers of dust coated the lid, and as I lifted it slowly, I was greeted with a sight that would change everything. Hundreds of letters, envelopes meticulously labeled with years and names, and stacks of financial documents sprawled before me. Each piece of paper was a fragment of a story I had only glimpsed before, a narrative of deceit, greed, and betrayal carefully hidden from my husband and the rest of the family. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, realizing that what I held was far more than old correspondence. It was proof of long-standing manipulation, secret withdrawals, and embezzlement of the inheritance my husband had every right to. I unfolded a letter carefully, recognizing my father-in-law's handwriting. The contents were meticulous, detailing accounts, property transactions, and instructions for distribution of assets after his death. And there it was, the horrifying confirmation of my worst fears. My mother-in-law had been diverting funds for years, controlling the inheritance with a precision that was almost surgical. Checks written to obscure accounts, signatures altered, ledgers manipulated, every document painted the same chilling picture. She had quietly stolen from the family she claimed to protect, betraying the very people she professed to love. The shock hit me in waves. I sat there among the dusty boxes, surrounded by evidence of her calculated deception, unable to breathe at first. My mind raced, piecing together the subtle hints I had noticed over the months, the comments about financial decisions, her casual critiques, the way she always positioned herself in conversations, and her uncanny ability to influence outcomes without overt confrontation. Everything now made sense. The small signs of warning, the subtle psychological games, the constant observations, they had been training me, unknowingly, for this very moment. I whispered under my breath, almost as if saying it aloud might shatter reality itself. So this is why Dad never trusted her. The realization was crushing. My husband's father, long gone, had seen through her facade, recognized her schemes, and guarded his secrets carefully, leaving behind this trove of documents for those wise enough to uncover the truth. And now, in my hands, I held the ultimate proof. The power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. As I continued to examine the contents, I discovered even more layers to her deceit. Handwritten notes tucked between official documents revealed the lengths she had gone to manipulate family narratives, control perceptions, and maintain her authority. She had created a web of influence so intricate that even casual observations could be misleading if one wasn't paying close attention. The depth of her planning, the cold precision of her actions, left me both in awe and furious with the injustice of it all. In that quiet attic, among dust and memories, I realized something crucial. The discovery was not merely shocking, it was transformative. It changed my understanding of the dynamics at play in our family. It clarified why certain decisions had always seemed to favor her, why certain conversations had subtly undermined my husband or others, and why no matter what I did to please her, it never seemed enough. The truth revealed a hidden world, one where power, control, and greed had been exercised with subtlety and patience for decades. The shock was compounded by a more personal revelation. Among the documents, I found letters addressed to me indirectly, correspondence my mother-in-law had written but never sent, detailing her judgments, expectations, and assessments of me as her daughter-in-law. They revealed her true opinion that she viewed me as a threat, someone who might one day uncover the truth. Every smile, every compliment, every subtle nod of approval had been calculated, masking a strategy designed to observe and control. The realization that I had been under her silent scrutiny for years was almost suffocating. I carefully photographed every letter, every document, and every financial record. Each image was a silent record, a testament to the truth she had tried so hard to conceal. I knew that these images would be invaluable, not for confrontation, not for immediate vengeance, but as a tool to plan, to strategize, and to execute a plan so precise that she would never suspect it until it was too late. The power of silence, patience, and observation had prepared me for this moment. As I worked, a sense of cold satisfaction began to replace the initial shock. I had been patient. I had observed. I had endured subtle manipulations, quiet judgments, and psychological tests. And now, armed with the undeniable proof of her deceit, I was in a position of quiet power. The mother-in-law who had seemed untouchable, who had manipulated, controlled, and deceived with finesse, was now vulnerable, not because of confrontation, but because I held the knowledge she had tried to bury. When I left the attic that day, the sun was dipping low, casting golden rays through the dusty windows. My hands were steady, my mind focused. The shocking discovery had not broken me, it had clarified my path. Every small observation, every moment of patience, every silent strategy one had practiced over the months had led me to this point. And I knew that the next steps, when executed with precision, would change everything. That evening, as I returned home, I looked at my husband playing with our son in the yard, laughter and joy filling the air. No one else knew what I now carried in my mind, what I had uncovered in that hidden chest in the attic. The weight of the secret was immense, but so was its potential. The shocking discovery was not an end, it was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan, a silent path to justice, and the moment when patience, observation, and strategy would finally converge into action. The days following the shocking discovery were heavy with anticipation. The attic, once just a quiet corner of my mother-in-law's house, had become a vault of truths too long concealed, each document and letter a fragment of a carefully constructed web of deceit. As I sorted through them once more, photographing and cataloging each piece, a new understanding began to crystallize. This was no ordinary family intrigue. This was a calculated scheme, a silent manipulation that had spanned years, affecting not just my husband, but every person who trusted her implicitly. And now, armed with the evidence, the moment to act, though still silent, was approaching. I returned home that evening with my mind racing. I prepared dinner mechanically, all the while thinking about the implications of what I had uncovered. The mother-in-law I had once tried so hard to please, the woman whose subtle critiques and careful observations had tested every fiber of my patience, was not the nurturing matriarch I had believed her to be. She was a manipulator, a strategist, a person who wielded influence over the family's wealth and decisions with the finesse of a skilled chess player. And yet, in her meticulous planning, she had overlooked one critical factor: my awareness. The first thing I did was consider the timing. My husband had no idea of the extent of her deceit. He trusted her, loved her even, and any sudden revelation could devastate him. I could not simply confront her, nor could I immediately reveal the documents. I needed a plan, one executed with precision, patience, and absolute discretion. This secret, once revealed, had to have the maximum impact, not just as a matter of justice, but as a safeguard for the future of our family. I began by analyzing the documents in detail. There were bank statements showing diverted funds, letters to lawyers that were never sent, and meticulous ledgers that charted her financial manipulation over the years. Each entry, each calculation, each note confirmed the extent of her control and deceit. I realized that her actions were not merely opportunistic, they were deliberate, long-term strategies to consolidate power over inheritance and family assets. The depth of premeditation was staggering. Among the letters, I found correspondence that revealed her knowledge of my husband's vulnerabilities and my own attempts to navigate the household dynamics. She had been tracking both of us silently, noting our patterns, decisions, and emotional reactions, using them to her advantage. She had orchestrated moments of tension, carefully chosen words to provoke self-doubt, and subtle manipulations to influence my husband's financial decisions. The realization that she had been surveilling us in such a calculated way was both infuriating and enlightening. I carefully organized the materials, creating a timeline of her actions. Dates, letters, transactions, they all aligned in a way that painted a clear picture. She had been systematically draining resources, shaping narratives, and controlling family decisions for her benefit. The letters even contained references to actions my father-in-law had intended to prevent, warnings she had deliberately ignored or circumvented. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the theft of funds, but because of the manipulation of trust, the quiet distortion of family bonds, and the exploitation of love and loyalty for personal gain. The magnitude of the secret's implications became painfully clear. This was more than inheritance or money, it was about control, influence, and power. She had created a false narrative, presenting herself as the caring, wise matriarch, while secretly undermining the very people who trusted her most. And now, having uncovered this web, I realized that revealing it required more than evidence, it required strategy. Every document, every letter, every photograph I had taken needed to be used at precisely the right moment. As I planned, I also reflected on the emotional landscape. My husband, unaware of the truth, remained devoted to his mother. Any hasty action could fracture relationships, harm him emotionally, or allow her to deflect and manipulate further. I understood that the timing of revelation was as important as the revelation itself. I needed to craft a path where the truth could emerge silently, where justice would be served without unnecessary chaos, and where my mother-in-law would face the consequences of her actions without a single word from me. I spent hours analyzing patterns, recalling conversations, and reviewing the subtle signs I had observed for months. The comments she had made about finances, her precise arrangements of household items, and her manipulative glances, all of it now fit into a cohesive narrative. It was astonishing how someone could orchestrate influence so quietly, so subtly, yet so effectively. And yet, in her confidence, she had left herself vulnerable. She had never anticipated that I, her daughter-in-law, would piece together the puzzle, document every detail, and patiently wait for the right moment to act. The preparation was meticulous. I created secure backups of every document and photograph, labeling them carefully by date and content. I mapped out scenarios in which the information could be revealed, analyzing her likely responses and planning my countermeasures. Every potential move she could make had to be anticipated and accounted for. This was a game of silent chess, and I was now fully aware of the board, the pieces, and the rules. Even in ordinary interactions, I adjusted my behavior strategically. I smiled when she praised small achievements, nodded when she offered advice, and laughed when she subtly criticized. Outwardly, I remained the polite, accommodating daughter-in-law. Inwardly, I cataloged every expression, every word, and every gesture, noting the psychological tools she used to maintain control. These moments became opportunities to gather further insight, deepen my understanding, and refine the strategy that would eventually bring her carefully concealed empire crashing down. The secret revealed was more than just financial manipulation. It was a revelation of character, a study of a person who had mastered subtlety and influence. I recognized that the stakes were higher than mere money. This was about family dynamics, trust, and the moral responsibility to protect the ones I loved. Every decision I made in the coming weeks would have to balance patience, observation, and calculated action. I reflected on the months of preparation, small signs of warning, moments of observation, careful documentation. All of it had led to this pivotal moment, the complete revelation of her secret, her careful deception laid bare. The knowledge was a weapon, but one that required precision, discretion, and timing. Any misstep could allow her to regain control, hide the truth again, or manipulate the narrative in her favor. As evening fell and the household settled into quiet, I sat at the dining table, reviewing the documents one last time. The magnitude of a secret, the depth of betrayal, and the potential for silent justice all converged in my mind. I understood that the next phase was crucial. The revelation had to be strategic, subtle, and decisive. This was not revenge born of emotion, but of calculated patience, a measured plan to restore balance and ensure that her manipulation would no longer go unchecked. The secret had been revealed, but the real journey was just beginning. I had discovered the truth, documented it meticulously, and prepared mentally and emotionally for the silent, calculated steps ahead. My mother-in-law, unaware of the extent of my knowledge, continued her life as if nothing had changed. Yet, I knew that everything had changed. The balance of power, the control of information, and the potential for justice were now in my hands, and the silent plan, rooted in observation, patience, and strategy, was ready to unfold. After uncovering the truth about my mother-in-law, a heavy silence settled over my household, one that carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. The attic discovery had been a revelation, but it was only the first step. I knew instinctively that hasty action would ruin everything I had painstakingly uncovered. Justice, in this case, required patience, calculation, and a level of subtlety that matched her own manipulations. This was the moment to strategize, to design a silent plan so precise that she would never suspect its existence until it was too late. I began by reviewing every document I had photographed in the attic. Each letter, each ledger, each financial record was analyzed, cross-referenced, and cataloged in meticulous detail. I created mental maps, timelines, and profiles of her behavior, noting patterns in her visits, her comments, and the subtle ways she influenced my husband and the rest of the family. Each observation I had made over months became invaluable, turning scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative that exposed her manipulation with unassailable clarity. The first step in the silent planning was patience. I learned that every move had to be carefully timed, each gesture deliberate. Any slip, any hint of knowledge could alert her, and she would become more cautious, more manipulative, and harder to confront. I reminded myself constantly that she had spent decades perfecting the art of silent control. Matching her required equal precision and strategy. I would need to plan every detail, anticipate every reaction, and execute without a single word revealing my awareness. Next came the psychological preparation. I knew that the power of my plan rested not just in the evidence I held, but in the way I would reveal it, or, in some cases, allow it to be revealed through natural consequences. I studied her habits, her routines, and her interactions with family members, identifying moments where subtle nudges could set events in motion. These nudges would need to be invisible, almost accidental, so that the unveiling of her deception felt inevitable rather than orchestrated. It was a game of shadows, one where the slightest misstep could undo months of careful observation. I also created contingencies. My mother-in-law was clever and resourceful. She had always anticipated the reactions of others and manipulated them to her advantage. I had to think several steps ahead, considering how she might respond if she sensed suspicion, if evidence slipped, or if a relative became curious. Each scenario was examined in my mind, weighed against the likelihood of success, and then integrated into a broader strategy that emphasized control, subtlety, and timing. In private, I rehearsed interactions with her. I imagined conversations, her likely tone and body language, and how I would respond to maintain composure while guiding her unknowingly towards situations where the truth could surface naturally. My outward demeanor had to remain perfect, polite, accommodating, even warm. Any trace of suspicion or hidden knowledge could unravel the silent plan. My control had to be absolute, but invisible, like a puppet master moving pieces without their awareness. The planning also extended to the family. I considered my husband, our son, and even other relatives, all potential witnesses or actors in the unfolding drama. I needed to protect them from emotional harm while ensuring that the revelations would ultimately benefit them. Their involvement had to be indirect, guided through circumstance rather than instruction, so that the exposure of her deceit would feel organic. Every detail, from timing of phone calls to scheduling of visits, was evaluated for its potential impact on the plan. Financial strategies were another layer of the silent planning. I reviewed the documents for loopholes, mistransfers, and opportunities where her mismanagement could be highlighted without confrontation. I cross-referenced bank statements, correspondence, and legal papers to identify precise moments where her actions contradicted her words, creating opportunities for subtle exposure. These details would not be used immediately but held in reserve, ready to support the narrative of truth when the moment arrived. Observation remained central. I continued to watch her daily routines, learning more about her unconscious habits, the way she lingered on certain objects, the emphasis in her tone when discussing money, and the subtle ways she reinforced her authority in the household. Each interaction, even casual visits, became an intelligence-gathering exercise, providing more pieces to the puzzle. The secret she believed buried was now an open landscape in my mind, mapped, understood, and ready to be navigated for maximum effect. The emotional dimension of the planning was equally important. I had to cultivate patience, restraint, and detachment, ensuring that my own reactions would never betray awareness. Anger, frustration, or haste could ruin everything. I reminded myself that the ultimate goal was justice and protection, not impulsive revenge. Each day, I practiced composure, masking my inner satisfaction at having uncovered the truth while maintaining the facade of the dutiful daughter-in-law. I also began to experiment with small, seemingly innocuous interventions. Slight rearrangements in schedules, gentle encouragements for family members to ask questions, and subtle suggestions for conversations that would naturally expose her inconsistencies. Each action was measured, appearing casual or coincidental, but carefully designed to place her in scenarios where her manipulations would become evident without a word from me. These micro-strategies were tested and refined over weeks, a quiet choreography in the shadows of family life. Throughout this period, I documented everything mentally and physically. Notes, photographs, and timelines were maintained meticulously, ensuring that no detail would be forgotten or misinterpreted. I created backups, both digital and analog, to safeguard against any unforeseen challenges. The plan was a living, evolving entity, adapting as new information arose, as behaviors shifted, and as opportunities presented themselves. As I implemented these small, deliberate actions, I noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Micro-expressions of frustration, slight hesitation in her tone, and minor adjustments in her routines indicated that the silent pressure I had applied was beginning to affect her, though she remained unaware of the full scope of my knowledge. Each reaction was noted, catalogued, and used to refine the strategy further. Even in social gatherings, I maintained vigilance. Conversations, family meals, and casual encounters became opportunities to subtly test reactions, reinforce patterns, and plant seeds of awareness. I never raised my voice, never accused, never confronted. The plan was not built on drama, but on the invisible accumulation of influence, patience, and precision. Every move, every word, every gesture contributed to a tapestry of silent power, preparing the stage for the eventual revelation of truth. By the end of the month, I had perfected the art of silent planning. The documents, the observations, the subtle interventions, and the psychological preparation coalesced into a strategy that was both comprehensive and invisible. The mother-in-law, unaware of my awareness and of a careful orchestration underway, continued her routines with confidence, oblivious to the fact that her empire of manipulation was quietly being dismantled piece by piece. The essence of this silent planning was patience, awareness, and precision. Each action was designed to ensure that when the truth finally surfaced, it would be undeniable, unassailable, and irreversible. The power of knowledge, combined with observation and strategic patience, had become my ultimate weapon. I had transformed months of frustration, observation, and emotional labor into a blueprint for justice, one that required no confrontation, only the quiet unfolding of truth. As I closed my notebook for the evening, I felt a sense of calm control. The mother-in-law had no idea that her carefully constructed world of influence was being quietly mapped, understood, and methodically prepared for exposure. The silent plan was in motion, invisible to everyone except me, and the moment of revelation, when it came, would be flawless. Every small act, every patient observation, every strategic adjustment had led to this point. Justice would be served, not loudly, not chaotically, but silently, efficiently, and irreversibly. And as I watched my husband and son laughing in the yard that evening, oblivious to the storm quietly building around them, I realized the full power of preparation. The secret, the observation, and the patience had created a foundation so strong that when the time came, my mother-in-law would have no defenses left. The silent plan was complete, the stage set, and the final act of justice was ready to unfold. With the secret fully documented and the silent plan meticulously mapped, I knew that the next phase would require more than patience. It demanded finesse, subtlety, and careful manipulation. Months of observation, recording behaviors, and analyzing interactions had culminated in this moment. I had learned how my mother-in-law exerted influence, how she subtly controlled conversations, and how she managed family dynamics without raising suspicion. To dismantle her quietly, I would need to mirror her tactics, but with a precision and purpose that she could never detect. I began by studying the environment she thrived in, the home, the social interactions, and even the casual routines of family life. Every detail mattered: the placement of objects, the timing of visits, the tone she used when addressing my husband, the pauses in conversation that signaled manipulation. These were not mere habits. They were her tools of influence, carefully honed over decades. Understanding them was crucial, not to mimic them mindlessly, but to subtly counteract them, to guide her actions toward the revelation of her own deceit. My first step was controlling perception. Outwardly, I maintained the appearance of compliance and deference, nodding politely at her suggestions, laughing when she offered advice, and showing attentiveness when she observed my household tasks. To anyone watching, I remained the dutiful daughter-in-law, eager to please and respectful of her authority. But beneath this carefully curated exterior, I was quietly steering the narrative. Each word I chose, each smile I offered, was calculated to elicit responses that would confirm her habits, weaknesses, and the patterns that I had already documented. I used indirect influence as a primary tool. Small, almost imperceptible nudges became the mechanism by which events would unfold. I suggested certain tasks to my husband in ways that seemed casual, knowing she would intervene in her typical manner. I introduced topics in conversation that would trigger her predictable responses. Every subtle manipulation was designed to lead her into revealing contradictions, hidden motives, or evidence of the schemes I had already uncovered. The goal was not confrontation but orchestration, to create situations where her own behavior would betray her. One afternoon, I orchestrated a situation that seemed entirely ordinary. I mentioned, almost casually, that I was considering organizing some old family photographs and letters, suggesting that it might be interesting to look for lost memories. My mother-in-law's eyes lit up immediately, a flash of excitement and pride that masked her controlling tendencies. She began to suggest methods of sorting, commenting on my approach, and subtly attempting to guide the process according to her standards. Yet, every word she spoke, every correction she offered, only served to reinforce the patterns I had been documenting. Each gesture and suggestion became evidence in its own right. I also used timing as a manipulation tool. Observing her habits revealed that certain moods and behaviors were predictable based on the day, time, and setting. Afternoons, when the household was quieter, often prompted reflective or directive behavior from her. Evenings, when she was tired but still sought control, could lead to small lapses or oversights. By strategically choosing these windows, I could guide interactions in ways that maximized the likelihood of revealing inconsistencies, contradictions, and evidence of long-term manipulation. The psychological aspect of careful manipulation required subtlety and restraint. I never allowed frustration or anger to surface, for those emotions would have given away awareness. Instead, I cultivated an exterior of calm, patience, and attentiveness, allowing her to underestimate my perceptiveness. Every compliment, every polite nod, every laugh was carefully timed to reinforce her confidence in her own control, while simultaneously tightening the invisible net of scrutiny I had placed around her actions. Even in casual social interactions, I exercised influence with invisible precision. Family dinners, small talks with neighbors, or brief encounters in the kitchen became micro-laboratories for observation and manipulation. By subtly introducing comments, questions, or actions, I could observe her responses, noting slight inconsistencies in stories or slight hesitations in tone. These small clues, gathered over time, created an invisible narrative of her behavior, which I would later use to guide events toward a revealing crescendo. I also leveraged indirect accountability. Without confronting her, I encouraged family members to ask questions about past events, financial decisions, or family traditions, framing them as curiosity rather than investigation. My mother-in-law, eager to assert her authority, provided explanations, clarifications, and justifications, all of which were quietly noted and compared to documented evidence. Each statement she made, each detail she provided, was silently logged, creating a detailed psychological map of her methods, intentions, and deceptions. Physical presence and body language became instruments of manipulation as well. I positioned myself in ways that subtly guided her movements, allowing me to observe gestures and facial expressions that betrayed internal reactions. I mirrored her tones when necessary, softened my expressions to encourage openness, and maintained eye contact at key moments. Each microaction was deliberate, designed to influence her without alerting her to my knowledge or intent. Documentation remained central to this careful manipulation. Every photograph, note, and mental observation was cross-referenced, verified, and stored with precision. When she repeated actions or made new comments, I immediately compared them against existing evidence, noting patterns, deviations, and opportunities for subtle intervention. The goal was always to stay ahead, ensuring that the unfolding plan would rely on knowledge, not guesswork, and on timing, not chance. The emotional dimension required equal care. I nurtured empathy and patience, remembering that the ultimate goal was not revenge born of anger, but justice delivered with precision. Every interaction had to be devoid of emotional outburst, for overt reactions would have exposed my awareness and potentially allowed her to manipulate outcomes to her favor. I practiced subtle restraint, controlling my expressions, my tone, and my gestures to maintain an appearance of normalcy while orchestrating events behind the scenes. As weeks turned into months, the careful manipulation yielded results. Small inconsistencies emerged in her stories. Slight hesitations became more frequent. Subtle reactions revealed discomfort when confronted with indirect evidence of past actions. And yet, outwardly, she remained confident, unaware that the seemingly ordinary days were actually carefully engineered sequences leading to her inevitable exposure. Each manipulated scenario, each strategic nudge, brought the silent plan closer to its culmination. Even my husband remained unaware, interpreting interactions as normal family dynamics. My careful manipulation ensured that he would remain unthreatened, unaffected emotionally, and perfectly positioned to witness the eventual revelation without bias or suspicion. This was crucial. The truth, when finally revealed, had to be irrefutable, unassailable, and undeniable. By the end of this phase, I had become a master of invisible influence. The mother-in-law, who had long controlled the household through subtle manipulation, was now unwittingly participating in a carefully orchestrated process that exposed her deception without confrontation. Every action, every word, every gesture had been guided, timed, and executed to ensure maximum impact while maintaining the outward appearance of ordinary family life. The power of careful manipulation lay in patience, strategy, and precision. I had transformed months of observation, study, and silent planning into a living process, guiding events, people, and behaviors toward an inevitable revelation. I knew that the next steps would not require force, confrontation, or overt challenge. The groundwork had been laid. The silent execution of justice was within reach, and the final unveiling of her deception would be complete, leaving no room for denial, deflection, or further manipulation. As I watched her moving through the household with her usual confidence, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Every smile, every nod, every subtle act had been carefully directed to guide her toward exposure. She remained oblivious to the invisible strings that guided her, and that invisibility was the ultimate weapon. The silent plan, strengthened by careful manipulation, was now poised to reach its crescendo. Justice would arrive without words, without confrontation, and with the precision of a strategy perfected over months of observation and preparation. The first tangible signs that my silent plan was beginning to take effect appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet their significance was undeniable. Every small interaction, every carefully placed suggestion, and every patient observation had been leading to this point. The initial victories, though quiet, were unmistakable. They were the first confirmations that months of meticulous preparation, documenting, photographing, observing, and manipulating were yielding results, and they filled me with a mixture of satisfaction, relief, and renewed determination. It started with minor inconsistencies in my mother-in-law's behavior that I had been expecting, now emerging without any direct confrontation. A casual comment she made during a family lunch contradicted information I had carefully documented in the attic. Her tone, which normally conveyed authority and certainty, faltered ever so slightly. She offered explanations, habitual excuses, meant to assert control and maintain appearances, but this time, every word she spoke only reinforced the discrepancies I had already recorded. I noted each of these subtleties silently, like a chess master observing the movement of pieces across the board. These first victories were psychological as much as strategic. I watched her confidence waver in small moments, such as when she attempted to subtly steer my husband toward her preferred financial decisions, only to have him ask a question I had planted in advance. The question, seemingly innocent and unrelated, forced her to navigate an unexpected contradiction, highlighting a lapse in her usually meticulous control. I noticed her hesitated, blinked rapidly, and reworded her responses, revealing her growing discomfort. Each minor stumble was a triumph in patience and precision, a proof that careful manipulation could quietly unsettle even the most calculated individual. I also achieved victories through indirect influence over household routines. Small suggestions, framed as casual remarks, caused minor disruptions in the patterns she relied upon to assert dominance. A reorganization of the kitchen, a subtle shift in family schedules, and a few gentle prods toward conversations about past financial decisions, all orchestrated with an appearance of coincidence, created opportunities for her control to be undermined without her ever suspecting. I saw her flinch at these moments, a micro-expression of irritation or surprise, signaling that the invisible net I had woven was beginning to constrict. Family interactions became microcosms for these small victories. I guided my husband and son subtly, planting questions or observations that elicited responses from my mother-in-law, leading her to unintentionally expose contradictions in her narrative. I positioned myself at the periphery, appearing attentive but uninvolved, allowing the dynamics to play out organically while maintaining my facade as the polite, accommodating daughter-in-law. Each small revelation, each minor admission, was a quiet step forward in the larger strategy. Even casual conversations with neighbors or friends provided opportunities to test her reactions. I introduced small pieces of information in passing, observed her responses, and noted the subtle changes in her demeanor. Her habitual control over social interactions was beginning to crack, evidenced by fleeting expressions of frustration, hurried clarifications, or defensive gestures. Each of these moments, though small, confirmed that the careful planning and manipulation had created an environment where her influence was no longer absolute. In private moments, I continued to refine my strategies, documenting each small victory and considering how it could be leveraged for greater impact. I reviewed photographs, letters, and financial records, correlating them with observed behaviors, and planned subsequent actions to amplify the effect of these micro-revelations. Every detail mattered: the way she rearranged objects, her tone when discussing family decisions, and even her habitual glances during conversations, all were cataloged and integrated into the evolving plan. One of the most satisfying victories came during a seemingly ordinary family dinner. I subtly guided a discussion about long-forgotten family events, ensuring that she was present and had to contribute. As expected, she attempted to assert her version of the story, embellishing details and emphasizing her supposed wisdom and control. Yet, as she spoke, I watched closely. Her narrative contained contradictions, minor errors, and inconsistencies that she failed to detect. The family, unaware of the full context, simply nodded, but I silently recorded the details, knowing these moments were quietly eroding her credibility and authority. These victories were reinforced by strategic patience. I did not act impulsively to confront her. Instead, I allowed the natural consequences of her own behavior to manifest. Minor slip-ups, small inconsistencies, and subtle reactions became evidence in themselves. Each unnoticed misstep reinforced the meticulous observations I had been documenting, and every recorded moment added weight to the eventual, decisive revelation. The psychological impact on her, though not yet overt, was significant. Small cracks in her confidence began to show. Her usual assertiveness now carried faint traces of hesitation. The carefully rehearsed smile faltered for a split second when unexpected questions arose. Her tone, once commanding, occasionally wavered. These micro-changes, invisible to most, were victories in my silent war, proof that the combination of patience, observation, and subtle manipulation could quietly destabilize someone who had long wielded power unchecked. I also achieved victories by creating situations where her own actions highlighted her deceit. Minor discussions about finances, inheritance, or family decisions were subtly orchestrated, so that contradictions became visible without confrontation. A misplaced comment, an inadvertent exaggeration, or an overlooked detail, all were quietly recorded, reinforcing the narrative I had built through months of careful observation. Each victory, though seemingly small, strengthened the foundation for the final unveiling of truth. My husband's trust and innocence remained intact throughout this period, a crucial aspect of these early successes. He interpreted the minor incidents as normal family quirks, never suspecting the deeper strategy at work. By maintaining his perspective, I ensured that the revelations, when fully revealed, would have maximum impact without causing unnecessary emotional harm. This careful balance between manipulation and protection was essential, and each small victory reinforced my confidence in the plan. Even the household environment itself became an instrument of subtle manipulation. I arranged documents, photographs, and letters in ways that suggested accidental discovery created opportunities for natural conversations about past decisions and timed interactions to exploit her predictable patterns of behavior. Every small act, though imperceptible to anyone else, contributed to a cumulative effect that steadily eroded her control and influence. I also observed the long-term psychological impact of these small victories. With each minor lapse, her confidence in her ability to dominate conversations, control narratives, and influence family decisions began to diminish. Subtle frustrations became visible in microexpressions. The cadence of her voice showed occasional tension, and her habitual gestures occasionally betrayed slight uncertainty. These indicators, carefully noted, confirmed that the silent plan was progressing exactly as intended. Each victory reinforced the lessons learned during months of careful preparation. Observation, documentation, subtle influence, and strategic patience had transformed into tangible outcomes. I saw proof that manipulation, when applied judiciously and invisibly, could undermine even the most calculated individual. These small victories were cumulative, setting the stage for larger, more decisive steps in the unfolding plan of silent justice. By the end of this phase, I recognized the power of incremental progress. Small victories, though seemingly insignificant in isolation, were collectively transforming the dynamics of family interactions and destabilizing the mother-in-law's control. Patience, observation, and strategy had begun to yield results. The stage was set for the next phase, where these accumulated victories would converge into a larger revelation, exposing her manipulation and deceit beyond doubt. And as I watched her navigating the household with her usual confidence, now subtly faltering in minor ways, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. Each unnoticed hesitation, each small contradiction, and each subtle response was a proof of the power of careful, patient planning. The silent plan was no longer theoretical. It was alive, dynamic, and steadily moving toward the ultimate objective, the complete, irrefutable revelation of truth, achieved without a single word of confrontation. The day of the silent climax arrived with the quiet inevitability of a storm that had been gathering for months. Every observation, every subtle manipulation, every patient plan I had executed converged into a single, precise moment, invisible to everyone but me. The household moved as usual, my husband tending to the garden, our son playing near the swings, and my mother-in-law, blissfully unaware, bustling around the kitchen as if nothing were amiss. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of the day, the tension was palpable. The invisible threads I had woven over months of preparation were now taut, ready to reveal the truth without a single word. I started the day with the usual composure, greeting my mother-in-law with a warm smile, nodding politely at her subtle critiques, and responding with calm attentiveness. Each gesture, each glance, each carefully modulated word was part of the orchestration. I had learned to mirror her confidence, matching her tone without revealing my knowledge, allowing her to maintain her illusion of control even as it silently slipped from her grasp. This delicate balance was crucial. The power of the silent climax relied on her complete ignorance of the storm about to break around her. The first signs of disruption came almost imperceptibly. I guided my husband to ask casual questions about past financial decisions, framed in a tone of curiosity rather than accusation. She responded as she always did, confidently, authoritatively, believing she controlled the narrative. But each answer she provided contradicted records I had meticulously documented. Letters, bank statements, and legal papers carefully photographed and stored. Her responses, meant to assert dominance, were now quietly undermining her credibility. I noticed subtle micro-expressions, an almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, a slight hesitation before speaking, a breath she did not intend to take, that betrayed her growing discomfort. I began to introduce the evidence in controlled, almost accidental ways. A ledger I had organized with dates, amounts, and annotations was left in plain sight during a family gathering. Letters carefully positioned on a side table caught her attention without direct instruction from me. These artifacts, seemingly benign, acted as triggers, allowing her own words and actions to expose inconsistencies when she referred to them. She adjusted her explanations, attempting to maintain authority, yet every response only made the discrepancies more apparent. The psychological pressure, though invisible to others, was immense. I observed her closely, noting each twitch of hesitation, each fleeting blush, each recalibration of tone. Her habitual control over family dynamics began to crack under the weight of silent exposure. I did not raise my voice, I did not confront her, and I did not accuse. Instead, I allowed the carefully constructed circumstances to unfold, guiding her without words toward the revelation of her own deceit. Timing was critical in this final act. I orchestrated the household's movements with precision. My husband's inquiries, the casual remarks I placed, and even the timing of our son's play outside created the perfect backdrop for her unraveling. Each interaction was layered to maximize the impact of her errors while minimizing suspicion of orchestration. By keeping the focus outward, I ensured that she would never suspect that her carefully constructed empire of manipulation was being dismantled piece by piece. The silent climax reached its first tangible milestone when a casual conversation about inheritance, prompted subtly by me, led her to inadvertently admit to actions documented in the attic. Her attempt to justify past financial decisions collided with the physical evidence I had positioned around her. For a moment, her composed exterior faltered, her voice wavered, her posture stiffened, and the practiced confidence she had relied upon for decades cracked like fragile glass. In that fleeting instant, I felt the full satisfaction of months of preparation, the silent power of knowledge meeting the strategic patience of execution. I continued to guide the interactions with precision. When she attempted to redirect the conversation, I subtly steered it back, introducing minor questions and comments that made her own words contradict previously established facts. Each contradiction, each microslip, was carefully catalogued in my mind, forming an invisible record that no one else in the room could see. To the family, she appeared simply frustrated, slightly off balance, yet unaware that this was the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated plan. Even her habitual gestures, those small, unconscious signals she had relied upon to exert control, betrayed her now. A hand tremble as she reached for a document, a slight flush as she explained a financial decision, a pause before speaking that revealed hesitation, all were small, almost imperceptible victories in the orchestration of silent justice. Each was noted, stored mentally, and became part of a larger pattern confirming that the culmination of the plan was near. The environment itself played a key role. I had arranged the furniture, the documents, and even the timing of household chores to create situations where exposure would occur naturally. A ledger left on the dining table, letters casually visible on a shelf, and strategically placed photographs became instruments of revelation. These objects, combined with subtle psychological nudges, forced her to interact with her own inconsistencies, laying bare the extent of her manipulation without a single direct confrontation. As the day progressed, small victories accumulated into a crescendo of tension. Her composed exterior increasingly faltered. Her habitual confidence in directing conversations, controlling decisions, and asserting authority diminished. Each microreaction, unnoticed by others, was a silent confirmation that the meticulous planning, patient observation, and careful manipulation were working exactly as intended. The pinnacle of the silent climax occurred when my husband, guided subtly by questions I had planted, confronted her indirectly with discrepancies between her words and the documents in view. She attempted to respond, attempting to assert control, but the contradictions were undeniable. Her practiced calm wavered, her eyes darted nervously, her voice lost its usual authority. I watched silently, the culmination of months of preparation unfolding with precision. Throughout the process, I maintained perfect composure. I smiled politely, nodded at her comments, and offered calm, measured responses, masking any trace of satisfaction. My demeanor reinforced the illusion of normalcy while allowing the natural consequences of her actions to unfold. She remained unaware that the entire sequence, the minor slips, the contradictions, the exposure, was orchestrated silently, guided by invisible hands that she never suspected. Even our son, playing innocently nearby, and my husband, still unaware of the full extent, witnessed the unraveling indirectly. The family observed subtle tensions without knowing their origin. This ensured that when the ultimate revelation came, it would be grounded in undeniable facts rather than accusations, making her deception fully visible to everyone without a single word from me. By evening, the impact of the silent climax was clear. Micro-errors, contradictory statements, and subtle reactions had accumulated, creating an environment where her manipulation could no longer maintain its facade. She moved through the household with her usual confidence, yet invisible cracks were everywhere, evidence of the effectiveness of strategic patience, careful observation, and subtle manipulation. The silent climax, though invisible to the untrained eye, represented the culmination of months of preparation. Each small victory, each observation, each strategically placed artifact of evidence had contributed to this precise moment. The mother-in-law, master of subtle control, was quietly exposed, destabilized, and unmasked without confrontation, raised voices, or dramatic accusations. As I cleaned the kitchen later that evening, carefully noting each document and photograph once again, I realized the full power of patience, strategy, and subtlety. The silent climax had been executed flawlessly. Justice was achieved invisibly, with maximum impact and zero confrontation. My mother-in-law's control had been dismantled piece by piece, and the family's understanding of her true nature was beginning to crystallize, though still shrouded in the subtlety of the unfolding plan. The silent climax had been reached, but I knew the story was far from over. Each small victory now converged toward the ultimate resolution, setting the stage for the final act where truth, justice, and carefully orchestrated revelation would collide, without a single word of accusation, only the quiet, unstoppable force of meticulous strategy and silent observation. The long-awaited moment had arrived, the culmination of months of patience, careful observation, and invisible manipulation. Every subtle nudge, every strategically placed document, every meticulously planned conversation had led to this point. The mother-in-law, who had spent decades controlling the family with calculated precision and quiet intimidation, was about to face the consequences of her actions. The air in the house felt heavier that morning, charged with anticipation, though no one but I understood the full magnitude of what was about to unfold. I began the day as usual, with polite smiles and careful attentiveness, concealing the satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. To anyone observing, I was the dutiful daughter-in-law, respectful and accommodating. But inside, I was alert, focused, and ready. Every move she made, every glance she cast, and every habitual gesture was carefully catalogued in my mind, ready to be used as part of the unraveling process. I understood that the power of the silent downfall lay not in confrontation, but in allowing her own actions and words to dismantle the carefully constructed facade she had relied upon for years. The first cracks appeared in the quietest ways. A casual remark from my husband about inherited responsibilities prompted her to reference past financial decisions she had made, unaware that I had left a detailed ledger of evidence in plain sight on the kitchen table. As she spoke, her words contradicted the documentation, and for the first time, she faltered in real time. Her hand trembled slightly as she gestured, her voice wavered, and a fleeting expression of panic crossed her face. These small, almost imperceptible cues signaled the initial stage of her downfall, a foundation built on years of deceit and control beginning to crumble silently. I guided the sequence of events carefully, like a conductor leading an orchestra, ensuring that each interaction contributed to the inevitable exposure. Family meals, casual conversations, and even the simplest household routines became tools in this intricate choreography. When she attempted to assert authority over a minor decision, I introduced subtle questions from my husband or son, framed innocently, that forced her to respond in ways that revealed contradictions. Each minor misstep she made was quietly recorded in my mind, contributing to the invisible dossier that chronicled her manipulation. Even small objects and documents played a critical role. Letters, photographs, and financial statements were placed strategically throughout the house, ensuring accidental discoveries that would catch her attention. She handled these items, believing them to be part of normal family organization, unaware that her every action was silently self-incriminating. The art of silent downfall relies on the target's oblivious participation, and she unwittingly fulfilled every requirement. Each interaction, each glance at the evidence, and each casual comment became a thread in the unraveling tapestry of her influence. I orchestrated family interactions with precision. Casual questions about past decisions or minor financial choices were subtly directed through conversation, guiding her toward exposing inconsistencies in her own narrative. The beauty of this silent justice was that she never realized she was orchestrating her own exposure. The micro-reactions, hesitation, subtle frustration, or fleeting panic, were small victories that accumulated, creating a psychological pressure that slowly, inexorably, weakened her composure. The psychological dimension of her downfall was particularly satisfying. She had spent years exerting control over conversations, financial decisions, and household routines. Yet now, every habitual gesture she relied upon to assert dominance was quietly undermined. Her tone faltered when faced with contradictory evidence, her confidence wavered when subtle nudges guided her responses, and minor gestures, like a nervous shift of posture or a momentary silence, betrayed her growing awareness that something was amiss. These small cracks were the prelude to the larger collapse, visible only to an observer who had been patiently documenting every nuance. I also used timing as a weapon. By choosing the moments when she was most likely to react unconsciously, afternoons when energy levels dipped, evenings when the household was quiet, or during casual family gatherings, I amplified the impact of each micro-exposure. She never realized that what seemed like ordinary interactions were carefully orchestrated events, designed to maximize the psychological and emotional impact of her own unraveling. A pivotal moment occurred when I guided a discussion around inheritance and family property, framing it innocuously through casual conversation. She attempted to justify decisions she had made in secrecy, unaware that all evidence had been subtly placed within her view. Her responses, meant to assert authority and control, collided with irrefutable proof. I observed a fleeting expression of fear, quickly masked with a forced smile, but the subtle tremor in her hands and the slight quiver in her voice betrayed the internal panic. For the first time, the carefully maintained illusion of control she had perfected over decades began to collapse. The silent downfall was not limited to words or documents. Small gestures, glances, and pauses in conversation were equally significant. Her habitual overconfidence, once a shield of authority, now acted as a vulnerability. Each movement she made, each subtle adjustment of posture, and each attempt to redirect the conversation reinforced the narrative of exposure. Her own unconscious actions were betraying her long-hidden manipulations, and the family, though unaware of the full context, could sense the tension and slight imbalance in her demeanor. Even casual social interactions outside the immediate household contributed to her unraveling. Comments from neighbors, brief conversations at local gatherings, and unexpected questions from extended family all acted as catalysts, drawing attention to minor inconsistencies in her stories. Each of these interactions was quietly noted, forming a comprehensive map of her vulnerabilities that had been created through months of careful observation and strategic intervention. By evening, the accumulation of small victories reached a tipping point. Her carefully rehearsed expressions of authority, once flawless, now cracked under the weight of accumulating contradictions. She became visibly flustered when handling documents, hesitated when recounting past decisions, and occasionally faltered in her tone when addressing family matters. The silent pressure I had applied over months was now fully manifest, creating a psychological collapse that was both subtle and irreversible. I observed her as she attempted to regain composure, adjusting her posture and smoothing over minor errors. Yet each attempt only highlighted the contradictions further. My husband, unaware of the full context, began to notice subtle tensions, yet interpreted them as ordinary familial quirks. The family, too, sensed a shift, a subtle imbalance, though they did not yet understand the depth of the unraveling. The brilliance of silent justice lay in this invisibility. The truth was being revealed through actions, reactions, and environmental cues, not through confrontation or argument. The final moments of her downfall were punctuated by her accidental exposure of long-hidden deeds. A remark about past family finances, a misstatement about inheritance, or a fleeting gesture toward a document became the culmination of months of preparation. Each minor slip was magnified by context, observed quietly by me, and mentally catalogued as part of the record that would permanently define her exposure. Her control, perfected over decades, had been dismantled without a single raised voice, without confrontation, and without overt conflict. By nightfall, the mother-in-law moved through the household with an uneasy air. Confidence, her lifelong weapon, had been stripped from her. Every habitual gesture, every authoritative word, and every attempt to assert control was now tempered with hesitation. The silent plan I had crafted, executed over months with patience, observation, and subtle influence, had reached its ultimate success. The master manipulator of our family had fallen, quietly, irreversibly, and unobserved by anyone but me. I watched her carefully from the background, maintaining composure while savoring the results of my strategy. She remained unaware of the orchestration, believing perhaps that minor tensions were trivial or coincidental, never realizing that each micro-failure, each subtle hesitation, was the direct result of patient, strategic planning. The mother-in-law's downfall had been achieved not through confrontation, accusation, or drama, but through invisible precision, quiet manipulation, and the deliberate accumulation of evidence and influence. As I reflected on the day, I realized the true power of silent justice. Months of preparation, careful observation, and patient manipulation had culminated in the complete dismantling of her authority. Her control, once absolute, had been eroded invisibly, step by step, action by action, until only subtle fractures remained. The family, still unaware of the full extent, would soon recognize the implications, but the satisfaction lay in the knowledge that justice had been achieved quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably. The mother-in-law's downfall was complete, not with confrontation, not with argument, not with drama, but with patience, strategy, and the quiet power of unspoken truth. The final act of silent justice had unfolded flawlessly, leaving her influence diminished, her credibility shattered, and her manipulations exposed, without a single word of accusation, only the undeniable weight of truth revealed through months of careful orchestration. The house was quiet now, the tension that had pervaded months of careful planning and subtle manipulation finally dissipating, leaving in its place a delicate, almost imperceptible stillness. My mother-in-law moved through the rooms with the faintest trace of uncertainty in her step, a shadow of the commanding presence she had once wielded over every corner of our lives. It was a strange kind of calm, the aftermath of a storm that had been invisible to everyone but me. The family carried on their routines, unaware of the silent climax that had reshaped the dynamics of our household. And yet, I felt the weight of months of strategy, patience, and quiet orchestration pressing gently against my own consciousness. I paused in the kitchen, the site of many small victories and pivotal moments, and reflected on the intricate tapestry of events that had led to this point. Each seemingly insignificant action, the placement of a ledger, a casual comment, a subtle question, had contributed to a chain of events that culminated in the mother-in-law's quiet downfall. The realization of how much power could be wielded without confrontation, how truth could be revealed through patient observation and strategic influence, was profoundly satisfying. It was not just about justice, it was about understanding the delicate balance of family dynamics, human psychology, and the invisible strings that guide behavior. The first reflections were personal, intimate, and necessary. I thought about the time spent observing her habits, the careful documentation of contradictions, and the mental mapping of her tendencies. Months of patience had been required to create this moment, and the emotional toll had been considerable. Yet, through it all, I discovered something essential about myself, the ability to act decisively, strategically, and silently when circumstances demanded it. I had cultivated patience not just as a tactical tool, but as a personal discipline, allowing my decisions to remain measured, deliberate, and unclouded by impulse. Looking back, the path had been far from linear. Early attempts to influence interactions, subtle nudges, and even the carefully orchestrated micro-victories had occasionally felt fragile, almost imperceptible. There were moments when I questioned whether my meticulous planning would ever yield tangible results, whether subtle manipulations could withstand the complexities of human behavior. And yet, each small victory had been a building block, each minor reaction a confirmation that patience, observation, and strategic foresight could bend even deeply entrenched patterns of control toward truth. The subtle reflection extended to the family as a whole. My husband, blissfully unaware of the orchestration behind the scenes, now experienced a subtle shift in perspective. The household dynamic, once heavily influenced by his mother's quiet manipulation, had begun to realign. He felt a sense of calm and clarity, though he could not yet articulate its origin. Even our son, who played innocently nearby, benefited from the restoration of balance within the household. The subtle reflection was not just about the consequences for the mother-in-law, it was about understanding the long-term impact on relationships, trust, and emotional stability within the family. I found myself contemplating the duality of human nature. My mother-in-law, capable of strategic manipulation for decades, had now been quietly unmasked. Her skills, once a source of control and influence, had become the very tools that revealed her inconsistencies. There was an almost poetic symmetry in the way patience and observation neutralized her power. In this reflection, I recognized that justice could be delivered in ways that were not overt, not loud, and not confrontational, yet carried an irreversible weight. The silent execution of strategy had revealed truths that would endure far longer than any argument or dispute could. The subtle reflection also encompassed moral and ethical considerations. While the outcome was satisfying, I consider the path I had taken, the observation, the strategic manipulation, the careful orchestration of circumstances. There was a delicate line between justice and intrusion, between patient guidance and calculated interference. In this reflection, I acknowledged the complexity of human relationships and the nuanced decisions required to navigate them. The victory was not simply in the exposure of deceit, but in the conscious, deliberate choice to execute it with subtlety, restraint, and precision. I walked slowly through the house, noting the traces of past interactions. The ledger still lay on the side table, the letters were arranged carefully as before, and photographs captured moments of both tension and triumph. Each object served as a silent witness to the journey, the months of observation, the patient crafting of scenarios, and the cumulative effect of careful influence. In these inanimate remnants, I saw both evidence and reflection, evidence of the mother-in-law's deception, and reflection of a strategy, patience, and subtlety that had guided the outcome. There was also a profound sense of empowerment that came with this reflection. I had discovered an internal capacity for strategic thinking, for understanding the intricate interplay of personalities, for executing complex plans without immediate recognition. The satisfaction was not merely in the result, but in the awareness that careful planning, emotional intelligence, and subtle influence could achieve outcomes far beyond what confrontation or force could deliver. This realization added depth to the subtle reflection. It was as much a personal journey as a familial resolution. Yet, the reflection carried a hint of melancholy. The mother-in-law, once formidable, now moved with a quiet uncertainty that was both a testament to the plan's success and a reminder of the fragility of human relationships. Change, even when justified, carries consequences. The delicate equilibrium of the household had shifted, and with it, the implicit trust, routines, and subtle power dynamics required gentle attention to maintain harmony. I understood that the silent execution of justice was complete, but the ongoing maintenance of balance and family cohesion was an equally vital consideration. I paused near the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard where my husband and son played. The day had been long, the tension finally released, yet the subtle reflection persisted. I thought about the months of planning, the accumulation of small victories, the careful orchestration of circumstances, and the ultimate dismantling of long-standing control. Each reflection was layered, combining satisfaction, awareness, and quiet contemplation of the strategies employed. The silent climax was over, the downfall complete, and yet the implications continued to ripple gently through our lives. The final layer of reflection involved the understanding of human resilience and adaptability. My mother-in-law, confronted with the invisible unraveling of her authority, would have to adjust, learn, and perhaps change. The family would adapt, reorganize, and heal. The process had demonstrated the subtle power of observation, the necessity of patience, and the enduring impact of strategic, silent influence. In these moments of reflection, I recognized that justice had been achieved not only for myself, but for the family as a whole, through the quiet rebalancing of relationships and influence. As night fell, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. The mother-in-law's presence remained in the house, yet her authority had shifted irrevocably. The family, though unaware of the full orchestration, moved with a restored sense of harmony. I felt the culmination of months of strategy, patience, and subtle influence coalesce into a quiet, enduring victory. Subtle reflection became an acknowledgement of process, outcome, and the intricate interplay between patience, observation, and justice executed without words. I realized that the power of subtle reflection lay in its capacity to internalize lessons, understand human behavior, and appreciate the nuanced execution of influence and justice. The mother-in-law's downfall had been complete, not with drama or confrontation, but with precision, patience, and quiet intelligence. As I moved through the house one last time that evening, I felt a sense of fulfillment tempered with awareness. The silent plan had succeeded, the family dynamic restored, and the long-term equilibrium preserved. In this quiet aftermath, I understood the true essence of subtle reflection. It was not only about what had been achieved, but about how it had been achieved, the patient, careful, and invisible orchestration that had restored balance, exposed deceit, and ensured justice without a single word spoken. The silent victory would endure, and its lessons would resonate throughout our lives, quietly shaping the family's future while honoring the meticulous process that had brought it about.